It's either an F-18 or an F-35. All day, every day. Tell me if you've heard this one. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. These are the words that began the newly ratified Constitution of the United States. Just after the Revolutionary War, with New Hampshire finally adopting it in 1778. Yet, while promising justice, domestic tranquility, welfare, and blessings of liberty and posterity, anywhere between 460,000 to 560,000 men, women, and children remained bound in slavery. Salutations, nerds. I'm Rick Y, the wise guy. And today is December 2nd, 2024, and in this episode, it marks the chapter in my mini-series, Black History is American History, regarding Black Americans and their tremendous achievements in the face of overwhelming adversity in our nation's infant stages. So if you dig learning more than you got in history class, hit that like and subscribe button, and sit back and let me learn you some stuff. The Revolutionary War is over, the Constitution is ratified, and America is well on her way out of what was called the Confederation period and is now heading into what is called the Federalist era. And it was called this because this was the period where the United States was strengthening her central government and coming into her own as a new country. The first executives of this period were slave owner George Washington and staunch opponent of slavery John Adams. The first two presidents represented a very clear divide that had already begun and would last for generations. As a new nation, America indeed had a lot of work to do. The problem was how many Americans wanted that work to be on the backs of indentured servants. We are all aware that the living conditions in the 1700s wasn't particularly cash money, no matter who you were. I mean, how can you watch Netflix if you keep running out of pemmican? Am I right? But legit, nobody in the period was enjoying large amounts of luxury by any means, but the Black Americans who were tasked with the hardest, most toiling jobs were also the ones who suffered the most. Yet, they were paramount to our country's success. Slave conditions in the early United States was abysmal, to say the least. Even worse in the Caribbean, where the British returned the Black loyalists, the folks who escaped slavery, to fight for the British to obtain their freedom, en masse, back into slavery. I don't know how many of you have ever known what it's like to live in the Caribbean or that part of America, because they think it's beaches and paradise, when in reality it's dreadfully hot and humid every second of every day of the year. I can personally attest to this because I lived in Central Florida for a while and it was incredibly similar. And God, the summers could just end up making you feel drained of your very soul, just walking from one place to another. You'd be covered in sweat. And I still didn't live as close to the equator as slaves in the Caribbean do. Not to mention the illnesses, like simple infections that can drastically blow out of proportion, even with access to medicine. Then there's the hordes of mosquitoes, some of which carrying horrifying diseases. And in these very conditions, Black slaves were forced to work up to 16 hours or more per day. In fact, Jamaica exploded in wealth. Well, white people did, because of the work that was endured by its slave populations, who farmed for the white Americans in the mainland. Further complicating the premise that racism isn't and never was inherently systemic, the new Constitution, just drafted, helped protect and enshrine slavery with the 3/5 Clause, the Fugitive State Clause, and in Article 1, Section 8, the Slave Insurrection Clause, which not only gave the government the power to put down any revolts by slaves, but, as not mentioned enough, it denied legal rights to enslaved rebels, regardless of existential threats. And in Article 1, Section 9, it provided the government to regulate, tax, and ban slave importation after 1808. From our nation's very inception, we codified the mistreatment of other human beings based entirely on the color of their skin. Suffice it to say, slavery was pivotal in the creation of our new country, whether you want to accept it or not. Our very infrastructure was dependent on the hard work of Black Americans against their consent, stripping them of what white Americans to this day consider unalienable rights. Because not only did Black Americans create the economic forces through unfathomable agricultural labor, but also land routes were cleared and roads from major cities were constructed. Canals and waterways were dug out, including the Erie Canal, which was built over 8 years and spanned 340 miles from Albany to Buffalo. And many of the laborers who worked on these massive projects with nothing but hand tools and black powder were newly freed Black men and slaves. A gentleman by the name of Isaac Wales was actually a slave from Syracuse who used what he earned in digging the Erie Canal to pay for his own freedom. This massive project created windfalls for communities and stirred travel and trade from distant places and had a huge impact on the early hubs of economic activity in New York. It also offered new ways of life for folks seeking revival throughout the early and mid-1800s. One gentleman by the name of Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey found refuge along the canal and hailed from the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland. He later took a new surname, began publishing an abolitionist newspaper, and will forever be remembered as Frederick Douglass. Also in New York, specifically Wall Street, a building which would be known as the first center of Congress, called Federal Hall, was constructed in the 1690s by slave labor, meaning the very document that enshrined their servitude was codified under a roof built by Black men. And meanwhile, in 1793, the cornerstone of the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. was laid down by then-President George Washington. It was eventually completed in 1826, after having been constructed on the backs of enslaved Americans. In October of 1792, the White House and seat of the government's executive branch began construction, and much like the Capitol building, from foundation to elegant facade, it was also built on the backs of Black slaves at the behest of the American government. Backing up, though, in 1803, Thomas Jefferson negotiated the Louisiana Purchase and increased the size of the new colonist nation by 828,000 square miles, having acquired the land from France. And in so doing, this created a fever for expansion in what white Americans called manifest destiny, which to them was a premise that they were given divine permission by God to expand and take by any means necessary the entire continent of North America. This meant further encroaching on already settled lands in the name of white Christian gods. Each new settlement, each new plot of farmland was employed by Black Americans, sometimes completely against their autonomy. During this time, inhumanities in the name of liberty were being well documented. The citizens of the New World stood at a fork in the road, and it was not lost on many that this was not something that we, as a free people, could nor would tolerate for much longer, as throughout the mid to late 1800s, the tension over the topic of slavery and human rights in general heated up to a point of combustion and eventually a firestorm of civil war. In the coming episodes, we're going to go over the valiant actions by enslaved Black people to create the path for those escaping the harsh brutality of forced labor, and the second time Black Americans stood on the breach of their own freedom. This time, though, their rifles pointed not at a foreign enemy, but at fellow Americans, in what would be seen as the darkest period of our nation's history. So stay tuned, stay engaged, and stay decent.